and welcome to my channel. My name is Dr. Rachael Tapman, and my channel is for anybody who cares about language technology and other people. And as usual, in these conversations, I'm joined by someone else in that boat. Although I would say, Chelsea, you're more sort of on the machine learning in general side and not specifically focused on language technology, but set, subset, etc. So today I'm joined by Chelsea Troy. Hello, Chelsea.
Hi, everyone.
So, do you want to start off by giving everyone some context? Who are you? What do you do? Why would I invite you here to talk to me?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. So my name is Chelsea Troy. I am a software engineer at Mozilla, a data engineer at Mozilla. And right now there I work on data privacy, in particular search data privacy. So one of the things that's really important to Firefox what makes it unique from some other browsers is our focus on user privacy. And believe it or not, there's a fair amount of tech that goes into that. I like to tell people jokingly that my job is to keep their weird sex searches from being traced back to them. And in reality, it is quite a bit more complicated than that. But people tend to remember that one, and they don't remember the more complex techie ones. But that's what I do right now. I've worked at a bunch of different companies working at the intersection of language analysis and automation. And this is kind of where I've ended up for now. The other thing that I do, which I want to mention ahead of time, which isn't immediately relevant in the intro, but might become relevant later, is that I teach. I teach programming classes at the University of Chicago, and I teach some workshops for O'Reilly. So if I start talking about teaching or pedagogy or anything like that, that is where that's coming from.
Yes, another thing that we have in common is an interest in teaching and doing it good, because it turns out very easy to do badly. Most people sort of assume that it's not, in my experience. Perhaps it's not true of everybody.
No, I would say the bar is on the ground with regard to, particularly, I would say software engineering education.
I have a list of things I want to talk about, but I think that's a great place to start, because something that is a source of constant frustration to me is talking to someone who's, so I don't come from a software engineering background, I come from a science background, specifically social science, linguistics, and then coming through that to more data science, NLP, computational linguistics, and sort of continuing on that way. So the thing about linguistics is that it's a very niche field. There's not a lot of people in it. Pretty much everyone who's doing linguistics professionally, it's because they love linguistics. And also there's a pretty strong culture of trying to teach good, right? Which is not true in all disciplines, to be frank, right? We're not trying to weed students out of linguistics courses. We're trying to convince them to stick around for the next one so we can talk about even more, morphology or whatever it is that you are particularly interested in. And coming from that field, being very inclusive and really thinking about pedagogy and how do you get students to think critically about something that they use every day but don't usually consider in this, systematic qualitative lens, formal lens, you might even say, and then coming to more of the computer science side, and it was like being, I don't know, a little baby bird that's been carefully nurtured by their family, and then you look over and there's just a puffin chick just on the ground that's been abandoned, and then you realize that you need to be where that puffin chick is, because that's where you're going to learn what you want to learn, but you're not going to have necessarily a great time with it. And I'm not saying that obviously all computer science education is like that, but it feels common. It feels common.
I would agree with that. I think that computer science is a bit of a unique and a weird field in that it is, how would I put this? It is a field that has stratified and re-stratified even over its short life of about 6 decades, as the people in it attempted to include the people they were trying to include and exclude the people they were trying to exclude. And so there are better resources than me on the specifics of what I'm about to cite. I would recommend Mar Hicks.
That's great.
Yeah, but so once upon a time, there were, for example, a lot more femme-presenting people in what we would consider to be computing, because at the time it was considered to be rote work, not unlike embroidering or something like that. As the field gained status, it experienced this sea shift in who worked in it. And when I say experienced a sea shift, that makes it sound like it happened by accident, which was not by accident. It was very much on purpose that kind of happened. And it became a profession much more dominated by, let's call it, the dominant demographic. And so that was sort of the first big sea change in who ended up doing it based on the way that the field was classified. Another sea change that it experienced, or I think sort of has experienced, is experiencing, or at least figuring out whether it wants to experience, is because it is this profession that happened to be the center of all of these companies that happened to be able to accumulate all of this money, is by dint of that an area that is lucrative that nevertheless does not have licensing, or at least doesn't have licensing yet.
Yep.
And that makes it unique because folks can end up in these software engineering professions at these companies where money is just thrown around like it doesn't matter, without having to first go through the extremely expensive gauntlet that most people in positions like that have to experience. $200,000 to $300,000 for a law degree, $300,000 to $400,000 for a med degree, something like that, which automatically makes folks in that field either people who were already extremely wealthy, or people who are willing to, did not come from a lot of wealth and are willing to continue not being wealthy while being around extremely wealthy people for 10 to 20 years while they pay off these massive, massive debts. Tech is, I would not call tech an inclusive field, but it is, a field in which that set of circumstances has allowed folks to, I'm going to call it, sneak in for now. This is from the perspective of founders and people who are sort of able to start these companies, who have pretty significant cultural differences in that regard. And I see this sort of re-stratification beginning to happen, sometimes along the lines of computer science education. There have been changing ideas for as long as computer science has existed around things like what counts as a programming language, what's considered like legitimate coding versus not legitimate coding. And in general, people have ideas about whether they think HTML or CSS is a quote unquote real programming language. Is SQL a real programming language? Interesting how that bears a lot of similarities structurally to some of the ones that are considered not programming languages, but SQL works with data, and big, strong, hardcore people do data. So that one's real. And then whether JavaScript, just all of these sort of weird distinctions, it's like a culture, half of which is trying to move the pieces to reestablish some stratification that this fast-changing field has already broken. And I see it a fair amount in sort of tech education and interviews as well. There are a lot of, this used to be truer, and I think is becoming less true, at least for the time being, but a fair amount of like where a lot of the money is consolidated within the tech community is in companies that interview around questions that are effectively proxies for, do you have a computer science degree? And the reason that they're direct proxies for that more than they're proxies for anything else is they're questions that would have been covered in an advanced algorithms class that you are nevertheless never going to implement in your entire career ever. Because a lot of them are, first of all, either complicated enough that if they are in wide use, they're already in a library, or B, they're already outdated because they were cutting edge in 1978, but they're not something that somebody would be using to do this filtering now. And it's interesting to see, because if we're going to stratify on, like, if we're going to have a field that is stratified without licensing, I think the way that would look is effectively an interview question that codes for, did you go to one of these 4 schools? That effectively puts a lot of the class stratification of licensing in place, even without the quality control measures that people sort of try to argue that licensing provides.
Yeah, those are a lot of things that I've been thinking about and talking about on the channel recently. Particularly, software engineering is not a profession like other professions are. It doesn't have licensing, but it also doesn't have the same degree of personal liability. As a personal trainer, I have more individual personal liability towards the people who I am training than I have ever had towards users as a data scientist. And it gets this, but it gets this like halo of professionalism from being next to other engineering disciplines and calling itself an engineering discipline. It gets the things that people associate with professions that they would like high salaries and respect. I think that's a great point too about interviewing questions really being this concepts of a shibboleth, right? Are you part of a specific social group? I believe it's from the Bible, and it was something that one group of people could pronounce in a specific way and other people couldn't. Another example would be the word squirrel, which is used to detect people who weren't native English speakers during World War. One of them, maybe both of them, I don't know. It's hard for non-native English speakers to say. So it was used as this quick test, as are you one of us? Should you be one of us? Yeah, do you get to be safe and part of the in-group, or do you get to be ostracized and not part of the in-group? Power hierarchies replicate themselves, right? And if you are in a position of privilege, then it's really, it feels very natural and normal to be like, well, of course there's a hierarchy, and of course I'm on top of it, right? And of course the way that you get to the top of the hierarchy is that you are like me. But that's not good pedagogy. That's not teaching people nothing about how to do the job. That's filtering for people who are as like you as possible.
Right.
Which is not great for society. And it's also not great for people who want to enter the profession and may be extremely good at it, but, you know, didn't get into Stanford or didn't even know that they needed to apply to Stanford, right?
Right.
Like, I'm from Virginia. If I wanted to get, you know, a top-notch computer science education in state,
UVA.
Yeah, I could go to UVA, I could go to Virginia Tech, but is that going to get me automatic interview at, let's say, that big tech firm that has a lot of alumni at it? Maybe in DC, probably not in San Francisco.
Right, not in San Francisco, which is honestly bogus because UVA has some of the best engineering education I have seen online. By far better quality than some of the places with. But that's perhaps a story for a different conversation, but I have been very impressed. Yeah, it's certainly an interesting thing. And I think that I appreciate what you've brought up about the value of pedagogy to bringing more diverse voices into an industry versus effectively pattern matching on who's already in there. Because I think tech finds itself in a position right now where it's going to live or die by the way it handles that. And I have this sort of entire rant on this on my blog, and I'll try to provide a very short version of it here. But effectively, sort of in the mid 90s, it was relatively easy with the advent of this new technology that made so many things more accessible by default. We now have the internet. We didn't have the internet before. There are all kinds of possibilities on the internet for people to have access to things that people didn't have access before. Even the rich, well-connected people, like no matter how rich and well-connected you were at the time, it still took a certain amount of time to be able to go and see somebody from, you know, Boston, where a lot of the big engineering groups were happening at the time, to the West Coast, to San Francisco or something like that. There were just limitations on what you could do across a barrier like that were drastically reduced by the internet and created this opportunity for folks who already were very wealthy and well-connected to create visionary products by drastically increasing access to things that people didn't prior have access to. Now, we are 30 years past that point, and the access created by the internet itself has largely been saturated by these companies. And because it was so innovative at the time, you could be pretty unimaginative and still build a multi-billion-dollar company by taking advantage of the access increase you could create by just riding the internet. And now it's not like that. 30 years later, we have this internet that was effectively built by and for wealthy, well-connected folks who already had a fair amount of access. And so the internet that we have now is that access is provided, and the same unimaginative ideas that made a big difference in 1998 just aren't going to succeed. They're not going to succeed as concepts. They're not going to succeed as capitalist vehicles in the same way anymore. The way that you create a visionary product is that you give people access to something that they did not have access to before. And right now, for the sort of dominant demographic on the internet, they already have all that. The only way, in my view, this is my soapbox, the only way to create a visionary technical product at this point is to deliberately prioritize the voices that were left out of the conversation about the original internet. Because there are no more new ideas in the boardroom now. There just aren't. We keep saying the same shit over and over again. Uber for this, Uber for that, Uber for pets, Uber for food. Okay, this is not a new idea. It's not increasing. We're trying. We're like in the bloodstream of visionary ideas. We are now in the capillaries on stuff that wealthy white people need. And like we're out of stuff there. And so tech is going to have to decide, are you willing to use this massive well of access that exists on the internet to create the visions that marginalized communities have that have been left out of the conversation thus far? Or are we going to continue to fight over the table scraps of the last halfway marketable ideas that at this point in like a very well saturated industry? And the way that we pattern match in interviews, the way that we attempt to select for like opinions is not going to give anybody, companies, organizations, anybody, the opportunity to create something visionary in the way that we always imagine that tech can or does or will, or even sort of like in the most halcyon pie-eyed versions of tech customarily does. It has to create that. I don't think it has to create that. I think at this point we're going to have to work really hard to make it create that. And part of that work is going to be deliberately bringing people into the room who have been, by various means, some deliberate, some accidental, shut out for 30 years. And part of that's going to be in the way we teach it, in the way we tell people whether this is for them or not, and help them get into it.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to pick on one of those threads here and bring back the discussion of privacy. So you mentioned this well of access, right? Like information flowing. And I think particularly with the, early internet, it was all like, you get the information, right? Information superhighway, it's all happening to you. And it feels like, certainly at some point in my lifetime, I can't put, a finger on specifically when it happened, it became much more extractive, right? Like, we are getting your information, right? That well of access has flipped. And something that I am increasingly concerned about as a technologist and just a person who lives in the world is privacy as luxury, right? Can you afford not to use the service with your ads turned on, right? Can you afford to opt out of that, recommendation categorization, right? Can you afford to not use the cheap piece of technology that has a bunch of trackers built into it and instead pay for the technology that you need the functionality, right? You don't have a choice about whether or not you use it. Can you afford to buy the one that's not tracking you because their monetization model is you pay for it and not we're tracking you? Or even like for me, right? I pay a service to get as much data, as much as my data as possible out of data brokers by filing takedown requests automatically. And not everyone can afford that, right? And that not everyone would know to do that. Also, I call myself a paranoid weirdo. that's paranoid weirdo stuff. Yeah, most people aren't going to do that. Most people don't know they need to do that. And I don't know, there's like a giant sucking sound where this dream of egalitarianism, I don't know, ever came to fruition was at one point.
Absolutely. I mean, it's true. It is. And it's something that I do think about all the time, particularly working at a privacy-focused company. It's one of the things that we talk about a fair amount because we have sort of ended up in this economy that maybe, part of the very first internet monetization strategies were banners. And folks joke that brightest minds in our generation are highly compensated and deployed on the task of making people click on ads. And like, when put that way, it's like true and depressing, but it's also the case that those ads, for better or worse, they keep the internet free. And I'm not sure, I'm quite sure, in fact, that I do not want an internet that folks are turned away from for lack of access to funds to be on it. And it puts us in this sort of dystopian catch-22, I think, of what price does a person have to pay at the door? And the fact that they can pay with their data when they can't or don't want to pay with money also feels dystopian and is also sort of part and parcel with the reality of the way that we have built the internet so far. And it's because that is so much the default, it becomes more difficult to even imagine alternatives to that and solutions to that we would be able to create. Like, all right, we want to make the internet free, but we don't want people to have to pay with their data or with their money in order to be on it. How do we make that sustainable? What makes that sustainable for people?
Yeah, what's the NPR of the internet? What is the internet as utility and a public good that's funded by the public for itself?
Right, exactly. And in order for that to happen, we would need effectively gubernatorial and regulatory changes. What do we have control over that? It would certainly take time, but maybe that's the campaign that we need to be running. And that's something that would take an amount of time that folks would also wonder, what can we do independently in the meantime? I think it's one of those things where a true solution really is going to come from a collective effort. But in the meantime, like, what individual solutions are being offered not a whole lot that I have seen. I'm familiar with only a couple. There's an app called UBD, Universal Basic Data Income. And the idea behind this app is that you can effectively, you may be aware of it already, but like allow certain organizations to use your data for a specific limited amount of time in exchange for paying you for the use of that data. And I wonder whether if the internet had not originally been built on top of an exchange model like that, as opposed to the one that it's in now, whether things would be better. And I don't know whether that would have even been possible. The internet grew up in a vacuum from a regulatory perspective. And had it not grown up in a vacuum from a regulatory perspective, maybe some of this wouldn't have happened. And I wonder whether what's going to eventually have to happen is that enough disasters is going to force that regulatory environment on us. I think that that's largely the way that it's happened historically with a lot of the professions that are heavily regulated now. Like law isn't as heavily regulated as it is because somebody thought it was the right thing to do. It's that way because all these disasters happen. Medicine 400 years ago, people were just hacking limbs off and seeing what happened. Like a lot of medical science and technology that we use today, we learned through studies, we'll call them experiments, that were by modern standards, wildly unethical and could never have been run. The United States, heavily regulated, such a pain in the neck. The reason it's like that is literally because all the houses lost their value 12 years ago, like 14 years ago. And I hope, the optimistic version of myself would hope that the internet can get there before a whole bunch of disastrous watershed moments force us to that place. But I'm not convinced it will, particularly not in the United States. There's some data privacy regulation in Europe, which I think is a great direction for us to look. But is that going to be adopted here where we are? Not confident in that, at least not until the issue is forced. And so I think it's particularly salient in an industry that appears to collect individualists to some degree. And so there's maybe even slower motion towards collective action than there might otherwise be, because it is an industry made up largely of folks who try to solve the problem themselves, which is, you know, a very romantic notion, but just not a practical one when it comes to actually getting stuff done a lot of times.
I forget where I heard it, but some of the things you were mentioning put me in the mind of a quote that safety regulations are written in blood, right? Like there's a reason, and the reason is something horrible happened. Yeah, the Tuskegee experiments were this century. They were not that long ago. For those of you who are not familiar, this was a series of experiments in the United States where black men who had syphilis were just allowed to die, and experimenters watched it happen, and it was horrific. And it was done, you know, in the name of science. And as a result, that's why we have IRBs at universities, to try and prevent that sort of thing from happening again. California has certainly in the US right now the strongest consumer data protection regulations, but if you're not in California, oh well. Yeah, and even with that, I don't know if you heard, there's someone who's trying to sue Clearview in Clearview AI, which is for those of you who are not familiar, we talk about it on the channel a fair amount. It's one of those companies that I would love to just stop existing, but they have collected your face and are using it for facial recognition that they are selling to various organizations, including governments. And an EU citizen found, I believe he was a privacy researcher, found that his face was in it and was like, hey, and as far as I can tell, that suit has not continued to make a lot of progress. So even if you do have the benefit of, you know, much stricter privacy regulations and protections than we do here in the United States, that doesn't mean you're not gonna not get your privacy invaded in ways that you don't want. It's also definitely something that I think about, is how do we as engineers stop this, right? There's, you know, how do we as citizens push our governments and like work actively to try and mitigate the harm that our, you know, we more than anyone know that our discipline industry is capable of. Both of those, discipline and industry. And then also, how do we as individuals and as people who are parts of groups of other individuals protect both each other and, you know, our users and society as a whole? And it's hard. It's hard, and I don't think there's any immediate solutions, but, you know, we can all wake up every morning and be like, I'm gonna do a little bit today. I'm gonna think about it, right? Like someone hands me a project proposal, I'm gonna look like, okay, so this thing, did you think about, I've thought about all the horrible ways this could go wrong. Did you think about this horrible way this thing could go wrong? Maybe we could change this to prevent it a little bit. So lots of little gerbils making a lot of torque.
Right. Yeah. Before I was working specifically on search privacy at Firefox, I was working at another team at Mozilla that works on article recommendations. So one of the options on your home screen on Firefox is that you get these article recommendations, and those article recommendations currently are not based on any personal data. They're based on editors picking out what they think people in general are going to like. And it turns out that is a thing that editors are pretty good at and have been good at for a long time, long before we had the ability to provide personalized recommendations. Newspapers were making plenty of money and lots of people were reading them. And so in any conversation about how to make something more useful to people by leveraging personal data, there is a twin conversation that I think we do always have at Mozilla around what personal data are we entitled to, and does it make sense for us to be using it, and how would we use it in an ethical fashion? And it's a conversation that I think it's one of many conversations in tech where I think a visionary approach is going to require the perspectives of people from marginalized communities, because among groups that don't have anything about them that's like considered edgy,
attackable perhaps,
right, then sure, it's relatively easy to have like a nothing to hide, nothing to fear perspective. But the example that I like to use for folks is a library. That if we wanted to create something like the internet version of a library, one of the things we have to think about is who goes to a library and why. And I think that's particularly salient perhaps for, let's say, folks from my generation who realized that they were LGBTQ, particularly in areas where that was especially socially unacceptable in like the 80s and 90s and even up into the early aughts. Because if you can't talk to your family about it because you might get removed from your family or excommunicated from your family, if you can't talk to your teacher about it because your teacher might go to your family, if you can't talk to other adults in your life about it because you don't know what's going to happen to you. And I think with some of the anti-LGBTQ legislation we're seeing now, this is becoming a reality for youth now, again, in a way that for a very brief period, maybe it wasn't as much of a reality. Where do you go? What can you do? And one of the answers for youth of my generation had been the library, because you can go to the library, you ask a librarian for what you need. That librarian does not know your name. They are not going to ask for your name. They are not going to ask you why you are looking for it. They are deliberately deployed to provide you with access to information without demanding answers as to why you want. In many ways, the exact opposite of what an exploitative data culture has created for us on the internet so far. And for somebody who figured out who they were by having access to a library with a librarian who is not going to ask them a bunch of questions, something like the harm that can be caused by the way that the internet provides information conditional on your own information now is not just a theoretical risk that they might be able to imagine if they think about it really hard. That's a very real thing that they have had to consider. These are the kinds of people to whom it's not a surprise that a company might leverage their data in ways that they don't want. These are the kinds of people who have always been putting into their Lyft app the address of a house down the block because they don't want somebody to know where they live. These are the kind of people who, when a Lyft driver asks them, "Are you headed home for the evening?" they say, "No, I'm headed to my boyfriend's," because they know that that's a safer answer, even if it's a complete lie. And if they're really scared, they add in something like, "He's a Marine, he's a police officer." Like and I think that one of the things that sometimes happens when folks don't imagine the way that this data for data approach can go wrong is exactly something like that. Is they're going to end up with a lot of bad data, a lot of data that is deliberately obfuscating the truth for the safety of the person. And I think that the dominant demographic answer to that would often be, well, let's just put in an automated solution that forces the issue, that requires an accurate answer. And I think the truth is, like, people are smarter than that. Eventually, they figure out ways around that. We use VPNs now to get Netflix shows that are not available in the area that they're supposed to be available because of the licensing rules and all of that. People find ways because it's much easier to transgress individually than like the advantages on individual transgressor side on stuff like that. And so I think we're in a situation where either we find visionary solutions that allow people access to information, that allow people access to the things that they're looking for in a way that doesn't exploit their data, at least an option that doesn't exploit their data, which is going to give us, admittedly, databases with a lot of empty rows. Or over time, we end up in a situation where we have folks working around those requirements in ways that create databases that are full of rows, some of which are accurate and some of which are bogus. And it's a lot more difficult to tell the difference between an accurate row and a bogus row than it is to tell the difference between an accurate row and an empty row. It's going to end up making analysis of data much, much more difficult. And we'd end up probably with cleaner and more accurate personalized solutions if we were willing to take just the accurate data for people who are willing and able to provide it and use that, as opposed to attempting to disambiguate folks who are perfectly happy to use the system as is from folks who need to subvert it for safety reasons.
There's a couple points there that especially stood out to me. And one is, we talked about sort of a workforce that tends towards homogeneity and self-replication of a small group of people. And I couldn't find the thread. I was looking for it recently. Perhaps they deleted it. But a while ago, I saw someone on Twitter who I perceived to be an older white man who was very senior in a technical position, said something along the lines of, oh, no one suffers physical violence these days anymore, which was a wild thing to assert to me. And what I realized is that what he meant is that based on his experience of the world, he doesn't believe that anyone would ever hurt him, which I don't think he saw the difference there necessarily. And again, perhaps, he thought better of this and deleted the tweet. But if you have the people who are making decisions around technology are all from that group or have that mindset, they're not going to know about the harm, right? They're not even going to know to look for the harm. I think of the Apple AirTags thing as a great example of the product reflections of perhaps a limited worldview. Another thing to think about that I think you brought up is, in this case, the example you gave of someone who's intentionally obfuscating their own data for reasons of maintaining their personal safety. So that would be, that's data poisoning as a result of poor product decisions. But especially on the machine learning standpoint, we also need to think about intentional data poisoning for malicious reasons. And that is not a solved problem, and it's something that I'm especially worried about with the rise of large language models, where the language model output is conditioned on the input, and people know that you are scraping the internet, capital T, capital I, to get that data, so they can just put it on there and make sure that it gets scraped, and then it's in the model, and then it has the potential to affect the output of the model. I'm particularly worried about this with Copilot in particular, because people knew that, people were scraping GitHub specifically to build models to generate code. How many triggers are there? So triggers are, for those of you who are not familiar with them, are a specific type of adversarial attack on large language models where a seemingly random string will trigger specific output. How many triggers are there, right? How many people are there who intentionally uploaded code with security vulnerabilities, perhaps across a wide variety of repositories with a certain degree of fuzziness, in order to intentionally introduce those security vulnerabilities? Question mark. We don't know. And I realize that's a sidestep from privacy, but this very greedy approach of just like, I'm going to take all this stuff, I'm going to put it into my big old database, and I'm just going to use it all. And I don't care why people put it out there in the first place and what their wishes were for me. I mean, you're gonna take stuff people don't want you to take, but you may also be taking stuff that you don't want to take, but people really want you to take. Again, as I mentioned, my background's really in NLP. It's concerning to me how many folks involved with large language models, and particularly selling large language models, aren't talking about this.
Right. I think that this is one of the concerns with GitHub Copilot that I have seen, particularly in large organizations that are deciding whether or not to be using it. I have not seen it used on any of the teams that I've been on, other than like somebody experimenting with it a little bit here and there. I don't know how much Copilot ends up being used at GitHub. Folks on your channel may already be familiar with GitHub Copilot, but the idea is we've got a large training model based on code that people put on GitHub, I think exclusively in public repos, but I don't know if they also use private repo stuff too. I would have to look that up. And the idea is to create basically the next generation integrated development environment that finishes your sentences for you from a code perspective. And as you point out, if what it's doing is using a lot of data off of GitHub, then I want to know that there was some very careful consideration of what's in that data. Certainly, intentionally malicious inputs could be in that data. There's also the fact that if a piece of integration code works and it happens to hit the Stack Overflow jackpot of everybody thumbs upping it as the answer, you get this sort of critical mass until everybody who goes to the internet looking for an answer on how to do that uses this piece of code, which has almost nothing to do with whether it's actually a good piece of code. It just means it's a minimally viable piece of code that hit the internet at the right time. And this happens constantly. There's this hilarious subreddit about the most embarrassing thing you wrote that people regularly use. And there's programmers who are like, 30 years ago, I wrote this bogus script when I was 14 years old. It's absolutely a mess, uses up too much memory, and there are certain situations where it's straight up wrong. And it is used by every single major company with more than 1 million people to do it, such and such in their database, because it was the way to do it at the time. And now I can't take it down. And like, we're not talking about infallible code that people have put on GitHub. People throw such random stuff on GitHub all the time. It almost becomes external storage for a lot of folks who are writing enough of it, every kind of learning project and thing that you can imagine. And there's a verification process that I can't imagine is happening, and even that wouldn't necessarily catch a well-hidden malicious attempt. But then on the other end, the idea and the thing that GitHub says is that you're not actually supposed to use the code it spits out. You're supposed to be guided and then verify, which, sure, it's very easy to abdicate personal responsibility and say, ultimately, the programmer who used this is responsible for the impact that it has. But we know for a fact that in programming, there's a fairly lazy pull request culture. There just is. If it's working, there are a lot of things that we don't necessarily check on. One of the things I teach a lot of workshops on is verifying that a piece of code is doing what we expect it to do and doesn't have side effects that we don't expect, and putting checks in place to make sure that that's not happening. And the truth is, it's a massive amount of work, and it does not help with trying to reach a deadline that the business set that was unrealistic in the first place. And there's a piece of this that I think there's a danger associated with introducing automation like this in a fast and loose culture like that. And it's something that I haven't seen a good solution for, just like I haven't really seen a good solution in sort of a lot of these separate cases. But this one, because it's my particular area of expertise, I can see use cases that might potentially mitigate that danger. One of the things that we have a massive problem with in software engineering is the maintenance load associated with keeping updated documentation. Either we don't keep updated documentation and then we suffer massive context losses anytime somebody leaves the company, or we write all of this documentation and then we take on the maintenance load associated with maintaining that documentation, which nobody wants to do because nobody wanted to write it in the first place. And so everybody just wants to be done with the entire thing. If there were an automated way to detect when documentation is getting out of date, I think that that would be an excellent use of something like a model like the one that GitHub Copilot is attempting to use. But that's not what we've done. We have not identified the specific, very narrow situations in which something like this might potentially be safe enough for use. And we've instead unleashed it on a much more generalized environment that I think has a lot of potential misuse vectors that have been either not considered at all or certainly insufficiently considered.
That's my personal worry about the field of NLP today, is this huge focus on multi-purpose generalizable models. I personally, in my professional life, can count on less than half of one hand the number of times when I've needed a general use model. Almost always I've needed something specific, small, efficient, data efficient, right? I never have as much data as I would like. And also just like compute and time efficient way of doing things. But that requires expert knowledge. That requires, particularly in a language context, you have to know enough about language to phrase a language problem in a way that is, you know, computationally, right? Going back to that problem of linguistics undergrads, most people have never had to think critically and logically, like formal logic here, about language, which is fine. Most people don't have to, but if the first time that you're doing it is to build a project that kind of has to work, And your other option is to use this very big, very expensive, very unpredictable product where you don't have to learn anything to use it besides, how to rephrase things just right. I know why people are doing it. I understand the appeal. I understand that it probably is saving developer time, but I don't know that it's making better outcomes, either in terms of our ability to evaluate what's happening as practitioners or in terms of, users in society in general. I don't know that it's making better software and tools for them to use. I also can't prove it's not, but that's my, personal intuition.
I would agree with that. I think that a lot of these solutions, at least a lot of the ones I see, they're theoretically multi-purpose, but they're multi-purpose insofar as that they can sort of pass as being usable in different circumstances while really erasing a fair amount of ontology of language use that I think ends up being really important, because we can imagine even in my life, in which I'm a relatively privileged person, I don't really have to hide who I am in many contexts. However, I have sort of the way that I talk at work. I have the way that I talk on personal projects. I have the way that I talk in social situations. I have the way that I talk on Twitter and the way that I talk on my blog. And all of these, same person, same N1 for the most part on all of these different platforms, using language differently to accomplish a different objective in a different environment. And a generalized language model would have a very difficult time capturing that. And even if it could capture that, it would then have to know the goal and the context at the use site in order to be able to leverage sort of the appropriate way of analyzing and producing language in order to work in that context. And I think a lot of them don't. I mean, it's even true in code. Now, code is more structured in general. More structured is not the correct term. In code, if you break the rules, the code doesn't work. Whereas in natural language, there are rules, but over time, those rules change. You can still get your point across without obeying all of the rules. And so from that perspective, there are ways in which code provides a lighter lift for a model. But even in those circumstances, people write code with different goals. I've written code with completely different goals. Same language, same IDE, would look the same on GitHub, but this one is prioritizing performance, it's prioritizing time spent or something like that for a very specific reason. This other one is prioritizing something else, and maybe it runs slower, but it's trying to, whatever, be more careful, reduce harm, do other things. And I'm not convinced that an attempt at creating a generalized model, even stratified by programming language, would be able to detect those differences. Maybe it would, but I haven't seen evidence that that happens accurately.
Yeah, that's a great point, particularly about different natural language usage. We talk about that on the channel a lot. Domain effects are sort of like the very broad way of talking about those differences. And I hadn't previously thought about the way that is reflected in code, but yeah, it's absolutely true. The, horrible, nasty, imperfect hack that does exactly the thing that you needed to do when you needed to do it is going to be better than the most beautifully written, perfectly optimized code that is 2 weeks late. And that's not something you see. I mean, you can maybe see reflected in the code, but it's not something that's going to be necessarily apparent to an outside observer why the one was better than the other. Really good points. Thank you. I definitely have a lot to think about. And before we wrap up, I see we're getting sort of close to time and I don't want to go too much over. What would you like to plug?
Oh, gosh, that's an excellent question. Once upon a time, I would probably say my Twitter handle here, but given the way Twitter's going, so I wrote a lot of tweet threads. I've been on Twitter for about 10 years and I've written a lot of tweet threads there. I am trying to move over any of those that I have not already moved to my blog, which is admittedly where you're probably going to find more of the well thought out things that I have to say anyway. It's generally half baked on Twitter and then I bake it when I put it on my actual blog, which is at chelseatroy.com. For folks who are particularly interested in natural language processing and machine learning, there is a machine learning category on there. And so that's likely to have a lot of what you would like. There are also a number of posts about just sort of the tech industry and the tech community in general. So there's a community category on there for that. I give workshops through O'Reilly if folks are interested. I'm working on a data integrity workshop, which is effectively going to be about, and this is still in the works, so it's going to be a while, but the idea is like, what do we need to be checking about the inputs to something like a machine learning model? And how could we do that? In what patterns could we put in place that would make something like that efficient and doable? But in the meantime, there's going to be a fair amount of ones on technical debt, working with legacy code systems that I find that even somebody who's focused particularly on the machine learning aspect often ends up having to do while trying to integrate into a system.
And I will try to remember to put the link in the bio. If it's not and you're watching this, leave a comment and tell me that it's not in the bio. This is not a call to action. This is a plea for help. Do you want to mention RigorWorks?
Sure, yeah. So I've got my little LLC. It's called RigorWorks. I have done a fair amount of consulting in the past, working with clients, particularly on machine learning deployment, and then sometimes some like data-focused software engineering efforts. I, this year, have done less. I've started to do less of that. My mom got sick this year, and so I'd been sort of focusing my efforts on her. So I don't do a lot of individual contribution type of work outside of my current employer anymore, but I still do a fair amount of training and teaching and coaching. So if folks are interested in that, I'm always up for that. As you have heard, I try to do a good job of teaching. And so hopefully I can sort of help progress our field that way.
That's always the hope. And are you still doing live coding as well?
Sometimes, yeah. I do live coding. That's at my YouTube channel, which I am Chelsea Troy on YouTube. I can provide you with a link also to the YouTube channel. And so there you'll see me tackle various problems from optimizing machine learning models to, I believe one of the more popular videos that I've done on there is how to make a custom weight cursor for iPhones. Not because I'm an expert in it, but as is the pattern, and we've discussed with apropos of the problems with Copilot, I was able to provide a minimum viable solution at a time when there was little existing documentation about another way to do that.
Founder effects.
That one's popular.
Now, I will try to have links to everything down in the bio. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation and hope everyone watching did as well. So thank you very much for joining, everyone. Thank you for joining, Chelsea, and I'll talk to you all later. Bye.
Bye.